Greetings, Shabbat Shalom. I don't know when you're going to hear this, but I'm speaking on the Sabbath in 2019 before the American holiday of Thanksgiving. And certainly Americans have a lot to be thankful for. I also want to tip my metaphorical hat to Canada. Canada has a Thanksgiving on the second Monday in October. And then the American Thanksgiving is on the fourth Thursday of November. It's quite a big, major holiday in America. It's the time when people do more traveling than any other time. Yesterday was November 22nd, a Friday. And I recall it was a Friday, November 22nd, back in 1963, when we had the trauma of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. And that next Sabbath was the first time I gave what many people who listen to me would call a sermonette. I'm not sure what we called it. It was an introductory talk before the reading of the Torah that I gave. I was, of course, only 17, but I gave a talk before the reading of the Torah in the synagogue in Fairfield, Connecticut that Sabbath. It's interesting that, as I recall, the portion for that week talked about Jacob and when Jacob departed, when he left the house of Laban, Vayetze Yaakov. And the person who gave the sermon that day, the rabbi was absent. I forget where he was. The rabbi was absent that day, so we had a man who normally had the title of ritual director, a great teacher, a wonderful man. His name was Mordecai Witcher, a wonderful man, a saintly man. He gave the message that day, and we used to call John Kennedy Jack as a nickname, and so it was interesting that the portion of the week was, and Jacob departed. And it's interesting that Jacob departed from the house of Laban, the White House, kind of a bizarre coincidence there. But the talk I gave that day as a teenager, my first, you could say, introduction to what eventually became something that I was called to do, I believe. That day I did base what I had to say on Pirkei Avot, the ethics of the fathers, but also on the words of John F. Kennedy in his inauguration. You should sometime look at the January 20th, I think it was, 1961, because I think they were able to do it on the 20th. There was terrible snow that day in Connecticut, and I had the day off from school and was able to watch the inauguration. I think that's how I wound up being able to watch it, because I was off from school that day. So I actually saw the inauguration and the inaugural address. It was just a wonderful talk, and it was only 15 minutes. But if you read that address, you'll see you'll probably want to cry about what has happened in politics since his time. I don't want to comment any further. I don't want to seem like I'm being polarized, so I won't comment any further. But the one thing we all appreciated about President Kennedy was his wit. He had quite a sense of humor. And back in the 1960s, there was a commercial for cigarettes, because in those days it was legal for television to have cigarette commercials, and they were very prominent back then, very colorful. And so one of the commercials said, "Are you smoking more today, but enjoying it less?" Well, at a press conference, the journalists asked Kennedy, as I recall, about the press coverage of the administration. So he answered and said, "I'm reading more these days, but enjoying it less." People got a big laugh out of that. I also have read that he described Washington, D.C. in a very witty way. He would describe Washington, D.C. as having all the efficiency of a southern city and all the charm of a northern city. So kind of a dig on Washington, D.C. But he was a New Englander, and they think their area is the best of the best. Today I want to talk about an inspiring biblical pattern. I'll call it that way. An inspiring biblical pattern. I want to talk about the types of John the Baptist and Jesus Christ, that of course prepare us for the antitypes, John the Baptist and Jesus Christ. So I'm talking about Elijah and Elisha, as we would say in American English, and then John the Baptist and Jesus Christ. I'm going to comment somewhat on that biblical pattern, the type and the antitype, but particularly Elisha as an antitype of Jesus Christ. Now, the Anchor Bible Dictionary, there is an Anchor Bible Dictionary, but the Anchor Bible Commentary, which was produced by people who, I would say this, they don't necessarily believe in the Bible, but they are very great experts in the Bible. They're academics who really know the Bible, even though they may not believe it. Like some people just are experts on Shakespeare, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they live their life according to what Shakespeare wrote. There are people who really are experts on the Bible, and then don't necessarily consider it authoritative. And I would say that's probably the orientation of the Anchor Bible Commentary. So it does have an awful lot of very valuable information. And in the book of Mark, if you look at what it says there, it'll talk about the book of Mark emphasizing Jesus Christ as the antitype of Elisha, Elijah's disciple. I want to go to the book of Mark, and here you have the baptism of Jesus Christ, and it's in the Jordan River. Verse 9, it came to pass in those days that Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And immediately coming up from the water, he saw the heavens parting and the Spirit descending upon him like a dove. So he was baptized in the Jordan and saw a heavenly sign. Then a voice came from heaven, "You are my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." And this is the situation with Elisha. Elisha is also baptized in the Jordan and also sees heavenly signs. He sees his mentor, if I could use that Greek term, taken up in a whirlwind into the skies and then, deposited no one knows where. He doesn't die, but he's taken away supernaturally up into the skies, up into the heavens, and off he goes, and he's, in effect, retired. And then we have Elisha taking over for him and doing a great deal more in terms of miracles than he did. He did miracles, yes, and Elisha does so many miracles, many miracles. And so it's similar to, analogous in a way to John the Baptist and Jesus Christ. John the Baptist didn't even do a miracle, as John 10 shows us, but Jesus Christ, of course, did many. In 2 Kings, the 2nd chapter, and it came to pass when the Eternal was about to take up Elijah into heaven by a whirlwind, that, of course, there are three heavens, and one of them is the skies up above there, and that's where he was taken. He wasn't taken into outer space, but he was taken up pretty high, I guess, into the skies and then taken away. Anyway, then Elijah said, by a whirlwind, that Elijah went with Elisha from Gilgal. By the way, I wanted to mention, speaking about Jesus Christ and what the Gospels reveal, I garbled some verses last week. I had the right message. I gave you the right information, but I somewhat garbled the verses. I want to make that correction in John 20. After Jesus ascended to his Father on that Sunday, during the days of unleavened bread, which was the antitype of the wave sheaf offering. Later that evening, he did appear to the disciples. And let's go to verse 19 of John 20. Then the same day at evening, being the first day of the week, when the doors were shut, where the disciples were assembled for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood in the midst and said to them, "Peace be with you." Now that was that first Sunday. But then if you keep reading, verse 26, and after 8 days his disciples were again inside, and Thomas with them. Jesus came to the doors being shut and stood in the midst and said, "Peace to you." So that was the next Sunday, in verse 26, and that's when he confronted Thomas. So what I said was true, but I kind of garbled the verses there. So I hope that has clarified that. And if you never noticed it, that's great. If you did, good on you. And if you didn't even see the message, go see it. I think you'll be benefited by it. Anyway, back in this chapter here, I'm going to jump ahead a bit because he makes a very special request of Elijah. Let's go to verse 8. Now Elijah, this is the 2 Kings 2 now, I'm back there. Now Elijah took his mantle, rolled it up, and struck the water, and it was divided this way and that. And so the two of them crossed over on dry ground. Wow! They crossed the Jordan River miraculously. And so it was when they had crossed over that Elijah said to Elisha, and I realize I'm pronouncing it American style, so those of you who speak Hebrew, your indulgence. Ask what I may do for you before I am taken away from you. So Elisha said, please let a double portion of your spirit be upon me. Ooh. So he said, you have asked a hard thing. Nevertheless, if you see me when I am taken from you, it shall be so for you. But if not, it shall not be so. Then it happened. So you see, in effect, Elisha was baptized in the Jordan River. He crossed through the Jordan and came out on the other side, and he came back that way too. Now they crossed over evidently to the east bank. Evidently, Elijah was a Tishbite. He came from Tishbe, and evidently it was in the east bank area of the Jordan. I'm speculating it was in the area belonging to the tribe of Gad, but I do believe that Elijah was a descendant of Aaron, a priest, but evidently living perhaps in the area of Gad, but on the east bank. He was called a Tishbite, and so perhaps he crossed over the Jordan to be baptized where he came from, in at least the region where he came from. That doesn't have to be done, but that's going to be normally what happens. I was baptized not in my hometown, but in my home region. Anyway, verse 11, then it happened as they continued on and talked that suddenly a chariot of fire appeared with horses of fire and separated the two of them, and Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven. So, as I said, off he goes. They didn't have rocket ships in those days, or airplanes, so off he goes. Now, Elisha obviously was broken down. This was my reaction many years ago when I heard that the man who was my teacher, an evangelist in the church, when he had died, I had that same reaction as Elisha had here. Verse 12, and Elisha saw it, and he cried out, my father, the chariot of Israel and its horsemen. So he saw him no more, and he took hold of his own clothes and tore them into two pieces. He also took up the mantle of Elijah that had fallen from him, and went back and stood by the bank of the Jordan. Then he took the mantle of Elijah that had fallen from him, and struck the water, and said, where is the eternal God of Elijah? And when he also had struck the water, it was divided this way and that, and Elisha crossed over. And there were witnesses to that. Now when the sons of the prophets who were from Jericho saw him, they said, the spirit of Elijah rests on Elisha. And they came to meet him and bowed to the ground before him. You'll find, if you read about Elisha Hanavi, if you read about Elisha the prophet, that he had a relationship with disciples, just as Jesus Christ had a relationship with disciples. That's very much brought out. You'll also find that he healed leprosy as Jesus Christ did. There are various parallels, many parallels between Elisha and Jesus Christ. And as I said, although Elijah did great miracles, Elisha did many more recorded in Kings. So he was given that double portion. And of course, as I said, John didn't do any miracles, but Jesus comes and does, of course, many miracles. I want to go to the fourth chapter of 2 Kings, around verse 42. So we're dealing now with the ministry of Elisha. And in the 42nd verse or so is what I want. Let's go to verse 42 of 2 Kings 4. When a man came from Baal Shalisha and brought the man of God bread of the first fruits, 20 loaves of barley bread, and newly ripened grain in his knapsack, and he said, then a man from Baal Shimon from Baal-Shalisha, a man came from Baal-Shalisha, and brought the man of God bread of the first fruits, 20 loaves of barley bread, and newly ripened grain in his knapsack. And he said, give it to the people that they may eat. Well, that's nice, but as nice as it is, it's not enough. But the servant said, what? Shall I set this before 100 men? He said again, give it to the people that they may eat. So now Elisha is talking to the disciple, and he said, give it to the people that they may eat, for thus says the Eternal, they shall eat and have some left over. Verse 44, so he set it before them, and they ate and had some left over, according to the word of the Eternal. Sound familiar? Those of you who are more familiar with the New Testament, you know about the miracle of the loaves and fishes. So here we have something similar with Elisha doing it as a precursor. Of course, Jesus Christ is much more sensational, a lot more people involved. Now I want to go to the 6th chapter of 2 Kings. And the beginning of the chapter. And the sons of the prophets. So, as I said, we have disciples that are talked about in the ministry of Elisha. So here we have in chapter 6, and the sons of the prophets said to Elisha, see now, the place where we dwell with you is too small for us. One lesson you learn from the ministry of Elisha is that he was very respected. People understood. Here was a man of God. Here was a man who could do miracles. And yet, they didn't give him much support. They when they needed help, they called upon him, and they certainly had a certain awe of him. But yet, they weren't committed to really supporting his ministry. You could see the way the disciples of Elisha were living. They were just barely getting by. It kind of reminds me of my yeshiva days. I was not in a well-endowed yeshiva. We did okay, but we were, we were just getting by, you could say, in my yeshiva. But later on, it did get itself more established. It's now located in Mountaindale, New York, and up in the Catskill Mountains. And as far as I know, it's doing all right. Anyway. Let's go to chapter 6 here of 2 Kings. And the sons of the prophets said to Elisha, see now, the place where we dwell with you is too small for us. Please let us go to the Jordan, and let every man take a beam from there, and let us make here a place where we may dwell. So he answered, go. So you see, they were doing a lot of their own labor and had a lot of their own supplies. So sometimes God's work has to function that way. God's work isn't always lavishly endowed, but the work gets done. And people do understand it is the work of God, even if they're not willing to support it. They're going to have to evaluate later on, why they didn't. But anyway, verse 3, then one said, please consent to go with your servants. And he answered, I will go. So he went with them, and when they came to the Jordan, they cut down trees. And I'm in verse 5, but as one was cutting down a tree, the iron axe head fell into the water. And he cried out and said, alas, master, for it was borrowed. So you see the situation of God's work at that time. Here were the future leaders of the church, you could say, if you're using it that kind of language. Here were the sons of the prophets, and they were concerned that an axe head had fallen into the water. They wouldn't be able to retrieve it, and it was borrowed. So you could see they weren't exactly living in the lap of luxury there. But Elisha performed a miracle and defied the laws of gravity. Verse 6. So the man of God said, where did it fall? And he showed him the place. So he cut off a stick and threw it in there, and he made the iron float, as if the iron is copying the stick. Incredible. So he does this sign, kind of like the staff of Aaron, of Moses and Aaron. Anyway, he puts the stick in there, and he made the iron float. Therefore he said, verse 7, pick it up for yourself. So he reached out his hand and took it. Very dramatic, very wonderful. And Jesus Christ also did a similar miracle, and we're going to get into that now. I want to go to Mark, the 6th chapter, around verse 34 when I get there. Mark 6 and around verse 34. Mark 6:34. And Jesus, when he came out, saw a multitude and was moved with compassion for them, because they were like sheep not having a shepherd. So he began to teach them many things. When the day was now far spent, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and already the hour is late. Send them away that they may go into the surrounding country and villages and buy themselves bread, for they have nothing to eat." But he answered and said to them, "You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give them something to eat?" A denarii would be a day's wages of that day, so that's a lot of money. But he said to them, "How many loaves do you have? Go and see." And when they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then he commanded them to make them all sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in ranks, in hundreds, and in 50s. You know, God does things decently and in order. 1 Corinthians 14. And when he had taken the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, blessed, because you thank God for the food, and the custom was particularly to thank God for the bread, which was the basic element of a formal meal. And so it's not a matter of asking divine intervention. You're just thanking God for the food. The custom was to say, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth." But that word also loosely means food in general. "Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who brings forth food from the earth." So that's called to bless, because you're blessing God. You're thanking him for saying how good he is to provide for us. He's of course omnibenevolent, perfect love. So that's what we mean by blessing. We're not asking for divine intervention to somehow purify the food if we haven't done our job, properly growing it. Anyway, and when he had taken the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, blessed and broke the loaves, and gave them to his disciples to set before them, and the 2 fish. He divided them all. So they all ate and were filled, and there was left over, just like in the case of Elisha, right? And they took up 12 baskets full of fragments of the fish. Now, those who had eaten the loaves were about 5,000. So it was a much more sensational miracle than Elisha, but of similar nature. And when he had sent them away, he departed to the mountain to pray. Now when evening came, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. Did I mention? Yes, I did mention. He saw a heavenly sign. He was baptized in the Jordan, as was Elisha. And now we see other parallels. We see the miraculous feeding of many, more than would normally be the case, with leftover. And now we're going to see defying the law of gravity, another miracle Elisha did that he also did. The axe had floated on the water. Now we're going to see something similar. In verse 48 now. Then he saw them straining or rowing, for the wind was against them. Now about the 4th watch, so this would be between 3 and 6 a.m. Now about the 4th watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. Oh, it's more than an axe head floating on the water now. Now we have a man walking on the water, and would have passed them by. And when they saw him walking on the sea, they supposed it was a ghost and cried out. This was a scary phenomenon to them, for they all saw him and were troubled. So they thought this was a phantom, some kind of supernatural hostile being. Some demonic being, evidently. A phantom of some sort. For they all saw him and were troubled, but immediately he talked with them and said to them, "Be of good cheer, it is I, do not be afraid." So here they see their master walking on water. Now that's impressive, I suppose even more impressive than what the disciples of Elisha saw when he split the Jordan, or at least equally so. Verse 51, then he went up into the boat to them, and the wind ceased. So, he goes above and beyond Elisha. He controls the elements here. Then he went up although Elijah had a similar situation where he prayed for no rain, and then he prayed for rain, as James 5 talks about. But John did not do any such thing as that. So Jesus far surpassed John, and just as Elisha surpasses Elijah in terms of the numerous miracles, and then Jesus as the antitype even surpasses Elisha, as you can see the more sensational miracles that he does of a similar type, but more much greater. So it's a type and yet beyond it. As I was talking about the other week, where he was an antitype of Moses, but infinitely superior. And now he's the antitype in another way of Elisha, but again infinitely superior. Now you had a pattern then. You had Aaron and Moses. Aaron being the older priest, and then Moses being the more secular individual. And then we had Elijah and Elisha. Elisha having more human interaction, it would seem. More personable in a way than Elijah. Elijah seemed to be a bit somewhat eccentric in his personality. And we have John the Baptist, again, who might come across as respected but yet eccentric. Jesus Christ being the life of the party. So we have this pattern. Anyway, let's continue here. In verse 51, then he went up into the boat to them, and the wind ceased, and they were greatly amazed in themselves beyond measure, and marveled. So they were just amazed. They were not yet converted. There's an interesting comment here in verse 52, for they had not understood about the loaves, because their heart was hardened. So it took time till they really began to grow spiritually to the point where he could use them as he later did. And ultimately, of course, they were converted. Ultimately, they received the Holy Spirit. And then, of course, powerfully began the New Testament church on Pentecost, where we had 120 disciples that multiplied, 25 times, where we have 3,000 baptized on Pentecost. So that was a process. They were 3.5 years being instructed by Jesus Christ. So we see this very inspiring biblical pattern where we have Elijah and Elisha as types of John the Baptist and Jesus Christ being the antitype of Elisha. And evidently it particularly comes out in the book of Mark. So it's something to think about and to see how God works with these patterns. And how we have the Old Testament and the New Testament. We have Moses and Aaron and Moses, which become eventually Moses and Elijah at the end of the book of Malachi, and in Matthew 17 and elsewhere we have that typology of Moses and Elijah. And here we have Elijah and Elisha, John the Baptist and Jesus Christ. There's other pairs too of that sort. I want to go now to Revelation 11. So we see in the New Testament that Elijah and Elisha are types of John the Baptist and Jesus Christ. And yet there is going to be an end-time Elijah. There was an Elijah who came at the time to precede the first coming of Jesus Christ, but he was an Elijah who didn't do miracles like the first Elijah. And I think that was because we needed to understand that as great as John the Baptist was, there's been no one greater other than Jesus Christ. As great as he was not the final Elijah. He was the Elijah to come before the first coming of Jesus Christ. But another Elijah will yet come before the second coming of Jesus Christ. And with him will come another witness, a Christ-like figure, perhaps probably a younger person. There'll be an older person who'll come along, then later on a younger one, and the two of them will be two witnesses before the second coming of Christ. I go now to Revelation 11 and verse 3. So we're getting now to really near the end of human history, but I like to often finish my messages by projecting forward to that time. So let's go to Revelation 11 and verse 3. And I will give power to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy 1,260 days clothed in sackcloth. These are the 2 olive trees and the 2 lampstands standing before the God of the earth. So you can go back to Zechariah 4, and you have pairs of witnesses there, right? You have Zerubbabel, you have Joshua and Zerubbabel, and you have Zechariah and Haggai. You have those pairs there. So these are the 2 olive trees and the 2 lampstands standing before the God of the earth. Now they are martyred. Elijah and Elisha were divinely protected. They were not martyred. These are martyred, but then miraculously resurrected. So if we go to Revelation 11, we see let's go to verse 12. After they are martyred, and this is Revelation 11:12, and they heard a loud voice from heaven saying to them, "Come up here!" And they ascended to heaven in a cloud, and their enemies saw them. Well, let's go back to verse 11, so we get the whole passage. Now after the 3.5 days, the breath of life from God entered them, and they stood on their feet, and great fear fell on those who saw them. And they heard a loud voice from heaven saying to them, "Come up here!" And they ascended to the heaven in a cloud, and their enemies saw them. And we understand what happens there. This is the prelude to verse 15. Then the 7th angel sounded, and there were loud voices in heaven saying, "The kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever." So let's dig into our Bible study and be inspired by these biblical patterns. I've shared today an inspiring biblical pattern. All the best to you and yours.